Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The trail was more overgrown than I had expected, the dense forest pressing in from all sides. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, which suited me fine. The isolation was the point, an escape from the noise of the city, a chance to lose myself in nature. Around midday, I veered off the marked path, drawn by a faint, unmarked trail that seemed less traveled. The forest here was different, quieter, darker, the air heavier. It was as if the trees themselves leaned closer together, conspiring to block out the sunlight. That's when I saw it. Hidden in a grove of trees, partially obscured by vines and moss, was a small hut. Its roof sagged under years of decay, and its wooden walls were warped and rotting. I hesitated. Something about the structure felt wrong, as though it didn't belong here. But curiosity tugged at me, and before I knew it, I was stepping closer. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on rusted hinges as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. My flashlight beam swept across the interior, revealing what at first looked like a haphazard pile of bones. But as I stepped further in, I realized they weren't random. The bones were arranged into intricate, almost ritualistic patterns. Figures resembling twisted animals and humanoid shapes sat atop crude altars, their forms grotesque yet deliberate. Symbols were carved into the walls, their meanings incomprehensible but undeniably sinister. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. Something about the macabre art pulled me in, a mix of fascination and revulsion keeping me rooted to the spot. My rational mind told me to turn around and leave, but I ignored it, pulling out my phone instead. The first few photos were shaky, my hands trembling as I captured the bizarre sculptures and symbols. The details were incredible, the way the bones had been shaped and fitted together with uncanny precision. Whoever had created these pieces wasn't just talented, they were obsessed. As I moved deeper into the hut, I became acutely aware of the oppressive atmosphere. The air felt heavier, and every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded deafening in the otherwise silent space. I adjusted my flashlight, its beam flickering slightly, and noticed something I hadn't before. A large figure, roughly human-shaped, standing in the corner. It wasn't moving, but the way it loomed over the room made my skin crawl. I snapped another photo, then quickly turned back toward the door. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. The steps were slow, deliberate, crunching against the dry leaves just beyond the hut. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside would hear it. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the hut into near darkness, save for the faint light filtering through the cracks in the walls. I edged toward the nearest crack, careful not to make a sound. Through the narrow opening I saw him, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, walking with a deliberate slowness that made every step feel like a threat. His clothes were dark and tattered, blending into the shadows of the forest, but his movements were unmistakably purposeful. Panic surged through me. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. There was no time to escape quietly. My only option was to hide. I dropped to the floor, squeezing into the narrow space beneath a broken table, my breath shallow and controlled. My phone, still clutched tightly in my hand, felt like a fragile lifeline. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. Then the door creaked open. The man's boots scraped against the wooden floor as he stepped inside. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked in place as I watched his feet move slowly through the hut. He paused at one of the bone sculptures, his head tilting slightly as if inspecting it. For a moment, I thought he might leave. But then he turned, his steps growing closer to my hiding spot. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound, my grip on the phone tightening. The table above me shifted slightly as his hand pressed down on it, the wood creaking under his weight. Then his hand dropped down, brushing against my arm. The shock of his touch sent a jolt through me. I lashed out instinctively, shoving his hand away and scrambling out from under the table. The man lunged, his fingers grazing my jacket, but adrenaline took over. I bolted for the door, my shoulders slamming into the frame as I stumbled outside. The forest blurred around me as I ran, branches scratching at my arms and face. My legs burned, but I didn't stop, the sound of his heavy footsteps chasing me through the trees. When I finally glanced back, he was standing in the doorway of the hut, his figure dark and motionless against the faint light inside. He didn't follow, he just watched. But even as I put more distance between us, the forest felt alive with movement. Shadows shifted, whispers rose from the darkness, and the faint echo of footsteps reminded me that I wasn't alone. I didn't stop running until my lungs felt like they would burst, my legs burning with every step. The forest around me was dense and tangled, the towering trees blotting out what little light remained. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one a sharp reminder of how far I was from safety. Still, I glanced back. The man stood at the doorway of the hut, his figure barely visible against the darkness inside. He wasn't moving, just watching. But the weight of his gaze was unbearable, as though it reached across the forest and pinned me in place. I stumbled forward, forcing myself to keep going. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their gnarled branches clutching at my clothes like skeletal hands. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig felt amplified, each sound sending fresh waves of panic through me. Then I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps. At first I thought it was my imagination, the echoes of my own frantic movements. But as I slowed, so did the sound, mirroring my every step. I froze, pressing myself against the trunk of a massive tree. The footsteps stopped, the silence pressing in like a vice. My eyes darted through the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. If anything, it grew stronger, as though the forest itself had eyes. I resumed walking, this time slower, more deliberate. My ears strained for any sound, my senses heightened by fear. The footsteps returned, faint but distinct, always just behind me. Low voices joined them, murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were unintelligible, guttural and broken, as though spoken by someone unfamiliar with language. I spun around, desperate to pinpoint their source, but the forest was empty. Panic clawed at my chest. I wasn't alone out here, of that I was certain. Whether it was the man from the hut or something else entirely, I didn't know, and I wasn't going to wait to find out. I broke into a run again, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing fleeting glimpses of the trail ahead. Shadows danced at the edges of the light, shapes that seemed to shift and disappear the moment I focused on them. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the footsteps until they surrounded me. My heart thundered as I pushed myself harder, stumbling over roots and crashing through underbrush. The forest felt endless, a labyrinth with no exit. Several times, I stopped to catch my breath, hiding behind trees or crouching in the undergrowth. Each time the sounds would fade for a moment, only to return when I moved again. It was as though they were playing with me, herding me deeper into the woods. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, the trees began to thin. The oppressive darkness gave way to faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the faintest glimmer of hope. I pushed forward, the undergrowth tearing at my legs. The footsteps and whispers were louder now, their presence almost tangible, as though they were breathing down my neck. I didn't dare look back. Then, ahead of me, I saw it, a clearing. The sight of open space sent a surge of adrenaline through me, and I sprinted the last few yards, bursting out of the forest and into the pale light of the clearing. The sounds stopped. I turned, expecting to see the man, or worse, emerging from the trees. But the edge of the forest was empty, the shadows still and silent. The oppressive feeling of being watched lingered, but the only movement was the swaying of the trees in the night breeze. I stumbled toward the dirt road that led back to where I'd parked my car. My legs felt like lead, every step an effort, but the thought of leaving this place behind was enough to keep me moving. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed against the door, my chest heaving with exhaustion. The familiar hum of the engine as I started it was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The road back to town was long and winding, but I barely registered it. My mind was fixed on the images from the hut, the bone sculptures, the symbols, and most of all, the man who had found me there. Walking into the park at dusk had become a small ritual for me. It was a space to clear my head, away from the clutter of daily life. The air was crisp, with the last light of the sun painting the trees in hues of gold and amber. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I followed the familiar path, winding through clusters of tall oaks and flowering bushes. Fewer people were out today. An occasional jogger, a couple on a bench, a dog walker with a lively spaniel tugging at its leash. I enjoyed the quiet. The hum of the city felt distant here, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the night. The dimming light gave the park a serene quality, though shadows stretched long and deep across the paths. I glanced at my watch. There was still time before the park's closing, or so I thought. As I continued, I noticed the emptiness around me. The last jogger had turned off a side trail, and the couple had disappeared down another path. The isolation wasn't alarming, just noticeable. I adjusted my scarf against the cool breeze and pushed the thought aside. This was my time, and I wasn't going to let my imagination spoil it. But as I rounded a bend, a strange sensation tugged at my awareness, an inexplicable sense of being watched. The path ahead curved gently, bordered by tall hedges on one side and a small pond on the other. The surface of the water reflected the deepening twilight, broken only by ripples from an unseen fish. It was here that I first noticed the figure. At first, it was little more than a silhouette, a vague, human shape standing several yards down the path behind me. I caught the movement in my peripheral vision and instinctively turned my head, expecting to see another late walker. But something about the way they stood, still and silent, unsettled me. They weren't moving toward me, yet they weren't lingering as if admiring the scenery. They were simply there. I faced forward and kept walking, quickening my pace slightly. Perhaps it was just someone else enjoying the evening air. Perhaps they were lost in thought, unaware of the unease their presence had sparked in me. But as I stole another glance over my shoulder, I saw they were following. Not running, not closing the distance, just walking, their pace matching mine. The park felt darker now. The lamps along the paths hadn't yet flickered to life, leaving me to navigate by the faint glow of the fading sky. My thoughts raced, searching for explanations. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. Still, my body moved faster than my reasoning, driven by an instinct I couldn't suppress. The park's main gate came into view ahead, and I felt a fleeting wave of relief. The figure was still behind me, closer now, though not alarmingly so. I didn't dare look back again. My focus was on the gate and the promise of the open streets beyond it. But as I reached the entrance, my heart sank. The gate was locked. I gripped the cold metal bars and rattled them, hoping the padlock wasn't as secure as it looked. It didn't budge. Panic began to creep in. I had lost track of time. The park had closed while I was deep in my thoughts. I cursed myself for not paying attention, for not leaving sooner. I turned back to the path, and there they were. The figure stood under the canopy of a tree, shrouded in shadow. Closer now, I could make out more of their form, tall, dressed in dark clothing, their features obscured by the poor light. They weren't moving anymore, just standing there, watching. My chest tightened. I felt like prey, trapped in an enclosed space with a predator I didn't understand. I couldn't stay here. My eyes darted along the perimeter of the park, searching for another way out, a gap in the fence, a service gate, anything. But the fences were tall and solid, and every path I scanned seemed to lead back to the locked gate, or deeper into the park's labyrinth of trees. The figure began to move again, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the uneven path. My breaths came shallow and quick. The air felt colder, heavier, as if it were pressing against me. The rational part of my mind screamed that I was overreacting, that this was just another person walking in the park. But my instincts told a different story, one I couldn't ignore. I ran. I didn't care how foolish it looked or how loud my footsteps echoed in the empty park. I needed to put distance between myself and whoever, or whatever, was following me. Branches scraped against my arms as I veered off the path, cutting through a patch of trees. The underbrush snagged at my pants, slowing me down, but I didn't dare stop. When I emerged onto another path, I saw it. A tree near the perimeter wall, its branches reaching high above the fence. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only option I had. The tree loomed ahead, its trunk thick and gnarled, with branches that extended high above the iron fence surrounding the park. I didn't stop to think about the difficulty of the climb or the risks involved. My focus narrowed to a single thought: escape. I reached the base of the tree and grabbed the lowest branch, hoisting myself up with trembling arms. The bark was rough under my hands, scraping at my skin as I climbed. My shoes struggled to find purchase on the uneven surface, slipping against moss-covered knots. I could hear the pounding of my heart, a steady rhythm that seemed deafening in the stillness. As I climbed higher, I dared to glance back. The figure stood at the edge of the path, their head tilted upward, watching me. Even from this distance, I could feel their gaze. They didn't make a sound, didn't shout or call out. They simply observed, their presence unnerving in its silence. My breath hitched, and I turned back to the task at hand, refusing to look down again. The branches grew thinner as I ascended, but I was close to the top. Just a few more feet, and I would be above the fence, high enough to leap to the other side. The thought of freedom pushed me onward, even as my arms burned from the strain. Finally, I reached a sturdy branch that extended beyond the wall. I steadied myself, gripping the rough wood as I gauged the distance to the ground below. It wasn't a small drop, but it was survivable. I just needed to jump. I hesitated for a moment, gripping the branch tightly. The drop looked steeper from this angle, and the ground below was uneven, littered with rocks and patches of grass. But the alternative, a return to the park and the figure below, was unthinkable. I took a deep breath and pushed off the branch, launching myself into the air. The brief moment of weightlessness was replaced by the jarring impact of my body hitting the ground. Pain shot through my ankle as I landed awkwardly, and I crumpled to the earth. For a moment, I couldn't move, my body protesting the harsh treatment. My hands pressed into the dirt as I tried to catch my breath, the taste of copper sharp in my mouth. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the throbbing ache in my leg. As I turned back toward the fence, I saw the figure. They stood at the base of the tree, their face obscured by shadow, their posture calm. They didn't attempt to climb after me. Instead, they simply stood there, watching. Their stillness was more unnerving than any pursuit. The sight sent a chill through me. I limped away, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the park. The figure didn't follow, but the sense of their presence lingered, like a dark cloud hovering just out of reach. The streets were empty as I made my way home, the distant hum of traffic the only sound breaking the silence. Each step was a struggle, my injured ankle slowing me down and forcing me to limp awkwardly. The pain was sharp and unrelenting, but I pushed forward, driven by the need to put the park and whatever had happened there behind me. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure trailing me. The sidewalks were empty, the shadows long and distorted under the dim streetlights. But the absence of the figure did little to calm my nerves. The feeling of being watched clung to me, like an invisible weight pressing against my back. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was just a misunderstanding, a coincidence. Maybe the person had been walking the same paths as me, their behavior misinterpreted in my heightened state of fear. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something deliberate about their actions, something calculated. The way they stood, the way they followed, it wasn't random. By the time I reached my apartment building, my body felt heavy with exhaustion. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. Stepping inside, I locked it behind me, turning every latch and bolt. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world feels comfortably muted. I had decided to stretch my legs, walking a familiar route through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. My mind was elsewhere, mundane things like work deadlines and whether I'd remembered to take out the trash. That's when I heard it. A muffled shout, followed by a low guttural sound that froze me mid-step. Instinctively, I glanced toward the source. There was an alleyway just a few yards ahead. A dim, flickering streetlight barely illuminated the area, but I saw enough. Two figures loomed over a third, who was slumped awkwardly against the brick wall. My heart skipped a beat when one of the standing figures moved, revealing a knife glinting in their hand. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what to do. My thoughts were scattered and incoherent. My feet acted before my mind, carrying me backward in slow, deliberate steps. But then it happened. One of them looked up. Their eyes locked onto mine, even in the dim light. I saw the sharp glint of recognition in their expression. I turned and ran. The world blurred around me as I pushed my body harder than I had in years. I didn't stop until I was home, my chest heaving, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Once inside, I pressed my back against the door, trying to convince myself it was over. They couldn't have followed me, could they? Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound felt amplified, each creak of the house like a gunshot in the silence. I spent hours pacing, occasionally peeking out the window. The street was empty, as it always was at that hour. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Morning brought little relief. I tried to act normal, dressing for work and heading out as though nothing had happened. But as I walked the familiar path to the train station, something felt off. A man in a dark jacket lingered a little too long at the corner, watching me as I passed. A woman across the street seemed to keep pace with me, her head turning just slightly when I glanced her way. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. By the time I reached the station, my breathing was shallow, my body tense. I forced myself onto the train, choosing a seat where I could see everyone. My eyes darted from face to face, searching for anything familiar. Nothing. Yet the feeling stayed with me, a constant pressure that made my stomach churn. That evening, I returned home under the cloak of darkness, my eyes scanning every shadow. The walk from the station felt longer than usual, each streetlight casting pools of light that only deepened the surrounding darkness. By the time I reached my front door, I felt like I'd run a marathon. I bolted the lock behind me and collapsed onto the couch, trying to decompress. But as the hours passed, the unease only grew. Around midnight, I got up and looked out the window, more out of habit than curiosity. That's when I saw it. A figure stood across the street, just beyond the edge of the nearest streetlight. They were motionless, their silhouette barely visible. I squinted, trying to make out details, but there was nothing distinct, just a dark shape staring in my direction. I stayed there, frozen for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the window with every light in the house turned off. My pulse thudded in my ears, each minute dragging into the next. I was sure they'd return, but the street remained empty. By dawn, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I woke up late, groggy from the restless night. My first thought was the figure. Had they come back? I hurried to the front door to check the lock, and that's when I saw it. Scratches surrounded the keyhole, faint but undeniable. Someone had tried to force their way in. My breath hitched as I examined the marks, my mind racing. Had they been here while I slept? I thought of calling the police, but what would I say? They hadn't succeeded in breaking in. And besides, what if this was just a coincidence? My rational mind and my growing fear battled each other, leaving me paralyzed. The rest of the day was a blur. I went to work, but every step felt like walking into enemy territory. I kept my head low, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. By the time I got home, I was a shell of myself. The scratches on the door were still there, a silent reminder that I wasn't safe. That night, I barricaded the door with furniture, hoping it would buy me time if they returned. Sleep was out of the question. All I could do was wait. The morning light brought little comfort. My barricade was still intact, but the scratches on the door felt like a taunt. I had spent the night jumping at every creak and groan of the house, my nerves fraying with each passing hour. It was clear now, I couldn't stay here. Whatever I had stumbled into wasn't going to stop. I started packing, throwing essentials into a bag without much thought. Clothes, important documents, a few personal items. My movements were rushed, frantic. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again. The street was quiet, but that didn't mean I was alone. As I packed, I noticed subtle things that hadn't stood out before. An unfamiliar car parked down the street, the engine idling for too long. A man in a hoodie walking past my house twice in the span of an hour. Were they watching me, or was my paranoia taking over completely? It didn't matter. I couldn't afford to wait and find out. By evening, I had everything ready. My plan was simple. Leave in the dead of night and head to a different town. Somewhere far enough that I could disappear, start fresh. But as the hours ticked by, a gnawing fear crept in. What if they followed me? What if I couldn't escape? I spent the evening sitting in the dark, waiting for the right moment to leave. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes every sound seem louder than it is. I was halfway through triple-checking my packed bag when I heard it. A faint scraping sound near the back door. My body froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like metal brushing against wood. I crept to the kitchen, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. The blinds over the back window were shut, but I could see shadows moving just outside. They were here. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy frying pan, and held it tightly. My hands were trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. The scraping continued for a few agonizing minutes before stopping abruptly. I didn't dare move. The silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes stretched into hours, and the shadows outside didn't return. But the damage was done. I couldn't stay another second in this house. Whatever they wanted, they were getting closer to taking it. My only option was to leave, no matter the risk. The sky was still dark when I slipped out the back door, my bag slung over one shoulder. I avoided the streets, sticking to alleyways and side paths that were less likely to be watched. Every step felt like a gamble. My ears strained for the sound of footsteps behind me, my eyes darting to every shadow. The town felt different at night. Streets I had walked 100 times before now seemed alien, their familiarity distorted by fear. Every corner I turned brought the possibility of running into them. My breaths were shallow, my muscles tensed for the moment I'd need to run. Finally, I reached the train station. The platform was almost empty, save for a few early commuters. I kept my head down, scanning the area for anything suspicious. The train arrived with a loud screech, and I boarded quickly, choosing a seat near the back where I could see everyone. As the train pulled away, I allowed myself a small moment of relief. For the first time in days, I felt like I might be safe. The street was unusually quiet as I walked along the cracked pavement, my footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. Streetlights cast pale yellow pools of light at regular intervals, their glow barely reaching the shadowed corners between them. It was the kind of evening I often enjoyed, calm, uneventful, and solitary. The air was cool but not cold, the faint scent of rain lingering from an earlier shower. I wasn't in any rush, taking my time as I followed the familiar route home. A few blocks ahead, I knew the street would open into a busier intersection, the kind of place where I could hear the low hum of traffic and see the occasional pedestrian. For now, though, the world felt empty, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was then that I noticed the car. At first, it was just a faint sound behind me, the low growl of an engine approaching slowly. I glanced over my shoulder, more out of habit than concern, and saw a dark sedan trailing at a distance. It wasn't unusual. This was a public street after all. But something about the way it lingered, maintaining its slow pace, made me pay attention. I turned back and kept walking, dismissing the unease creeping into my thoughts. It was nothing, I told myself. Someone taking their time, maybe looking for an address. Yet as I crossed another block, the car remained behind me, its pace mirroring mine with unsettling precision. As I approached the next intersection, I felt a flicker of relief. This was a main road, wider and well lit, with the occasional car speeding past. I reached the corner and turned to cross, pausing briefly to glance back at the sedan. It was gone. The street behind me was empty, the faint hum of its engine replaced by the silence of the night. I exhaled, chiding myself for letting my imagination get the better of me. It was probably nothing, a resident of the neighborhood or someone lost in thought while driving. I crossed the street and continued along my way, the faint tension in my chest beginning to ease. But as I turned onto another quiet stretch of road, I saw it again. The sedan was ahead of me now, parked by the curb, its engine off. I stopped mid-step, my breath catching. How had it gotten there so quickly? I hadn't seen it pass me. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to make sense of the situation. My pulse quickened as I realized there was no logical explanation. It had to have taken a different route, one I hadn't noticed. I resumed walking, this time faster, trying to convince myself that the timing was a coincidence. But as I passed the car, I couldn't help but glance at it. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see inside. The vehicle sat silent and still, but its presence felt oppressive, as though it was watching me. The street ahead stretched long and empty, bordered by rows of darkened houses and the occasional fenced yard. My earlier calm was long gone, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The car's engine roared to life behind me, breaking the silence with a suddenness that made me flinch. I didn't turn around. My focus was on the path ahead, my feet moving faster now, though I fought the urge to outright run. The car crept forward, its headlights sweeping over me as it closed the distance. It wasn't speeding or honking, just moving at a steady pace that matched my own. The deliberate nature of its approach sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this someone I knew, trying to play a prank? Or was it something more sinister? My instincts screamed at me to get out of sight, but the street offered no immediate refuge. No open stores, no pedestrians, nothing but locked doors and empty yards. As I neared the next intersection, the car slowed again, stopping just short of the corner. I crossed quickly, hoping to lose it, but when I glanced back, it had vanished. The relief I felt was short-lived. As I continued down another isolated stretch, the car reappeared behind me, its headlights off this time, gliding silently down the road. Panic set in. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned my surroundings for a place to hide or seek help. The houses on either side of the street were dark and uninviting, their windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. I quickened my pace, nearly breaking into a jog, but the car matched my movements with eerie precision, maintaining its slow, steady pursuit. Up ahead, I spotted a house with its porch light on, a faint beacon in the otherwise darkened street. Without thinking, I veered off the sidewalk and ran toward it, my shoes pounding against the pavement. My breath came in short gasps as I reached the porch and banged on the door, my knuckles stinging with the force. "Please!" I shouted, my voice breaking in desperation. "Someone's following me." I glanced back at the street, my heart hammering in my chest. The car had stopped just a few yards away, its engine idling softly. It didn't move, didn't reverse or drive forward. It just sat there, the driver hidden behind the glare of the windshield. The seconds stretched into eternity before the door creaked open. I turned back to see a middle-aged man standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. I pushed past him without waiting for an invitation, my body trembling as I stepped into the safety of the house. The door shut behind me with a heavy final click, cutting off the sound of the idling engine outside. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The man, clearly startled by my sudden arrival, stared at me with wide eyes. His home was modest, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. A dim lamp in the corner cast long shadows across the room, and the muted hum of a television played somewhere in the background. "What happened?" he asked, his voice sharp but not unkind. I pointed toward the window, unable to speak yet. My throat felt tight, and my chest heaved as I tried to compose myself. Slowly, the man moved to the front window, peeking out through the curtains. I followed his gaze, heart hammering, and there it was, the car, still parked outside, its headlights dark, but its presence unmistakable. The silhouette of the driver was barely visible, a shadowy figure motionless behind the wheel. "They've been following me," I finally managed to choke out. My words felt distant, as though I were hearing someone else say them. "Everywhere I go, they're there." The man pulled the curtain closed and turned back to me, his expression grim. "You're safe here," he said firmly, though the uncertainty in his tone betrayed him. "Stay where you are." I sank into a chair near the door, my body heavy with exhaustion. Every sound from outside, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, set my nerves on edge. The car remained outside, its presence an oppressive weight pressing against the thin walls of the house. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour, as we waited for it to move. At some point, I noticed the engine had gone silent. I turned to the man, who stood by the window, still peering through the curtains. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid. He glanced back at me and motioned silently for me to join him. I approached the window cautiously, my steps quiet against the hardwood floor. When I peeked out, the car was still there, but the engine was no longer running. For a moment, it seemed as though the driver might step out, but nothing happened. They remained inside, unmoving, the shadowy figure a dark outline against the faint glow of the streetlights. And then, without warning, the car started again. The low rumble of the engine broke the silence, making me flinch. Slowly, it pulled away from the curb, its tires rolling over the asphalt with deliberate slowness. It didn't speed off or swerve, it simply glided down the street, turning the corner and disappearing into the night. The tension in my chest released, but only slightly. My mind raced with questions. Why had they been following me? What did they want? And why had they left so suddenly? The man next to me seemed to sense my thoughts, his expression still clouded with concern. "I think they're gone," he said, though his tone was far from confident. Despite the man's reassurances, I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Every muscle in my body was tense as I stepped outside, half expecting the car to reappear the moment I set foot on the sidewalk. The street was eerily quiet, the stillness amplifying my paranoia. The man had offered to call the police, but I'd declined, unsure of what I would even report. A car following me? No license plate, no tangible threat, just the oppressive weight of fear. I thanked him as sincerely as I could, though the words felt hollow, my mind too preoccupied to focus on gratitude. He watched from his porch as I walked away, his silhouette a small comfort as I moved further into the darkness. The journey home felt endless. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I scanned the streets constantly, my head darting from side to side, searching for any sign of the car. My injured nerves conjured phantom headlights in every corner, shadowy figures where none existed. The closer I got to home, the more I felt the weight of the night pressing down on me. The safety of my apartment seemed so far away, a fragile promise I wasn't sure I'd reach. When I finally reached my building, I slipped inside as quickly as I could, bolting the door behind me. The familiar surroundings of my small apartment offered little comfort. My eyes darted to the windows, scanning the street below for any sign of movement. The car wasn't there. The street was empty, save for the flicker of a broken street lamp casting sporadic light across the pavement. When I first started working for the Langley family, it seemed like an ideal setup. They lived in a sprawling house on a quiet suburban street, the kind of place that practically gleamed with perfection. The exterior was all clean lines and manicured hedges, and the inside was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. It felt more like a staged showroom than a home where a lively 7-year-old lived. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Langley, were polite but distant. Mr. Langley was tall and impeccably dressed, with a voice that carried authority even in casual conversation. Mrs. Langley was quieter, her movements precise, her words always carefully chosen. Despite their reserved nature, they seemed to adore their son, Ethan. He was a sweet, bright kid who had a fascination with puzzles and would spend hours explaining the intricacies of his favorite ones to me. There were rules, of course. Certain rooms were off limits, like the small study on the second floor and the locked basement. I didn't think much of it at first. Lots of families have spaces they don't want disturbed. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice little oddities. The way Mr. Langley would abruptly end phone calls when I entered the room. The way Mrs. Langley would close her laptop whenever I came too close. It was subtle, but enough to plant a seed of curiosity. It started with a note. I was tidying up the living room while Ethan worked on a jigsaw puzzle at the coffee table. As I picked up a stack of magazines from the couch, a small slip of paper fluttered to the floor. At first I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a shopping list or reminder. But when I picked it up, the words scribbled on it sent a chill through me. Package received. Keep everything locked until further notice. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, and it didn't match the neat, controlled script I'd seen Mrs. Langley use. I stared at it for a moment, my pulse quickening. before hastily tucking it back into the magazine and placing the stack where I'd found it. Later that evening, while Ethan was drawing in the kitchen, I wandered into the study, a room I knew I wasn't supposed to enter. The door wasn't locked, and I justified the intrusion by telling myself I was just checking for stray toys. On the desk, half hidden beneath a pile of papers, was a small recording device. I pressed play out of sheer curiosity. The recording was faint but audible, voices I didn't recognize discussing something I couldn't quite piece together. Words like shipment, contact, and protocol stood out, and there was a nervous edge to the tone. I stopped the playback abruptly, my hands shaking as I placed the recorder back exactly where I'd found it. I left the study, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. After that, the house began to feel different. I started noticing things I hadn't before, details that seemed insignificant until I added them to the growing list in my mind. There were late-night visitors who never stayed long, their sleek black cars parked discreetly in the driveway. Once, I overheard Mr. Langley talking on the phone, his voice low and urgent, mentioning a location I didn't recognize. Other discoveries followed. A locked drawer in the kitchen that I found by accident when searching for a lighter. A manila folder left out on the counter one evening, its contents quickly hidden when Mrs. Langley entered the room. Even Ethan mentioned odd things, like the important meetings his parents often had in the basement late at night. The unease grew, but I couldn't bring myself to quit. Ethan needed me, and I couldn't leave him in the care of people I was beginning to distrust. I told myself I was overthinking, that the Langleys were just private people. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, I caught Mrs. Langley watching me. It was subtle at first, just a glance from across the room while I helped Ethan with his homework. But when I looked up, her gaze didn't waver. It wasn't the polite curiosity of an employer. It felt probing, as though she were dissecting my every move. I smiled, pretending not to notice, but the tension was palpable. The next day, Mr. Langley made an offhand comment as I was leaving. "You're very good with Ethan," he said, his voice even but unnervingly deliberate. "But it's important to remember your place. This is our home, after all." I nodded, unsure how to respond, and hurried out the door. It was the first time he'd said anything that felt remotely threatening, and it left me rattled. Over the following days, their behavior grew colder. Mrs. Langley's smiles became forced, her words clipped. Mr. Langley's presence, always commanding, now felt oppressive. There were moments when I caught them whispering together, their eyes darting toward me before quickly looking away. They knew. Somehow, they knew I had seen the note, listened to the recording, or noticed too much. The realization made my stomach churn. I began to dread going to work, the once innocent house now feeling like a trap I couldn't escape. The tension reached its peak a week later. I arrived at the house one morning to find the atmosphere heavier than ever. Mrs. Langley barely spoke to me, her curt nod the only acknowledgement of my presence. Ethan, usually cheerful, seemed subdued, glancing nervously at his mother whenever he spoke to me. Mr. Langley wasn't home, or so I thought. While helping Ethan put away his toys in the living room, I noticed something out of place. A small, leather-bound journal sat on the coffee table, its worn cover partially hidden beneath a stack of newspapers. I hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen, where Mrs. Langley was busying herself with breakfast preparations. The journal looked ordinary, but something about its placement felt deliberate, as though it had been left there by mistake. I couldn't resist. With trembling hands, I opened it, flipping through pages filled with messy handwriting. Names, dates, and locations were scrawled across the pages, none of them familiar, but all of them ominous. One entry stood out, written in bold letters, "Never trust outsiders." Beneath it was a list of initials, and at the very bottom, my own, LM. A sudden noise startled me, a faint creak from the floor above. I snapped the journal shut, my heart pounding as I shoved it back under the papers. My mind raced. They were keeping track of me. They knew far more about me than I had ever told them. I made it through the rest of the day in a haze, every interaction with Mrs. Langley charged with fear. When I left the house that evening, I told myself I wouldn't come back. It wasn't worth the risk. But the thought of leaving Ethan behind, unaware of what was happening around him, filled me with guilt. The next morning, I arrived at the house with a sinking feeling in my stomach. Something was wrong. The driveway, usually filled with the Langley's sleek cars, was empty. The curtains, always drawn back to let in sunlight, were closed tight. I knocked on the door, waiting for the familiar sound of Ethan's footsteps running to greet me. Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. A chill crept up my spine as I reached for the handle. It turned easily, the door swinging open into a house I barely recognized. The once pristine interior was eerily bare. Furniture was missing, the walls stripped of their art and family photos. Ethan's toys, which usually cluttered the living room, were gone, leaving the space empty and cold. The air was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and something faintly chemical. I stepped inside, calling out hesitantly, "Mrs. Langley? Ethan?" No answer. I moved through the house slowly, every step echoing in the emptiness. The kitchen was bare, the countertops wiped clean. In Ethan's bedroom, the bed was stripped, the walls void of the colorful posters he had loved so much. It was as though the family had vanished overnight, leaving no trace of their lives behind. In the master bedroom, I found a single piece of paper pinned to the wall. Written in the same jagged handwriting as the note I had found weeks earlier, it read, "We warned you." I stumbled out of the house, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I called the police, struggling to explain the situation through my panicked breaths. When they arrived, they searched the house thoroughly but found no clues as to where the family had gone. "It looks like they left in a hurry," one officer said, his voice detached. "It's strange, though. No reports of a moving truck, no neighbors saw anything. Are you sure they didn't tell you they were leaving?" I shook my head, numb. How could I explain what I had seen? The notes, the recordings, the journal? It all sounded so implausible, like the paranoid delusions of someone desperate for attention. I stayed quiet, afraid that speaking too much might draw their attention to me. Days turned into weeks, but the Langley family never resurfaced. The house was put up for sale, the real estate agent unable to provide any answers about the sudden vacancy. I tried to move on, but the sense of unfinished business lingered like a shadow, following me everywhere. The grocery store wasn't a place I thought much about. It was just another errand, a box to check on an otherwise uneventful evening. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I stepped through the automatic doors, greeted by the cool, sterile air that always hit like a wave. The faint sound of soft pop music played overhead, mixing with the chatter of cashiers and the faint squeak of shopping carts. I grabbed a basket, mentally running through my list. It wasn't a long one, some bread, milk, and a few other basics. The store wasn't particularly busy, just a handful of other shoppers wandering the aisles, their carts rattling quietly. I always appreciated the relative calm of this time of day, when the chaos of the daytime rush had ebbed away, leaving the store peaceful. As I moved through the produce section, I noticed someone standing a few feet away, their back turned as they examined a bin of apples. They were unremarkable, medium height, wearing a plain hoodie and jeans, with their hood pulled up. I didn't give them a second thought and moved on, grabbing a bunch of bananas before heading toward the bread aisle. It wasn't until I saw them again, this time near the loaves of rye bread, that I even registered their presence. It wasn't unusual to see the same shopper more than once, especially in a smaller store, but something about the way they lingered near the same shelves as me, always just within sight, stuck in the back of my mind. I stopped in the dairy aisle, scanning the shelves for my preferred brand of yogurt. As I reached out to grab a container, the same person walked up and stood just a few feet away. They bent down, reaching for the exact same flavor and size I had just picked. I glanced over, and for a moment our eyes met. Their face was partially obscured by the hood, but their expression was blank, almost disinterested. They turned away quickly, as if avoiding further contact. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence. People shop for similar things all the time. I moved on, heading to the snacks section to pick up some chips. As I stood there deliberating between two brands, I noticed them again, this time just down the aisle. They were holding a bag of chips, studying it intently, though their presence felt too deliberate. My stomach tightened slightly, but I pushed the thought aside. It was just timing, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. Still, I felt a faint unease as I made my choice and walked toward the frozen foods. It wasn't until I hit the cleaning supplies aisle that the pattern became impossible to ignore. I was scanning the shelves for laundry detergent when, once again, the stranger appeared. They weren't pretending to browse this time. They walked straight to the detergent I had just picked up, grabbing the same brand and size without hesitation. My pulse quickened. I decided to test my theory, stepping back from the shelves and walking toward the pet supplies aisle, a section I didn't need anything from. Sure enough, within moments, the stranger appeared at the far end of the aisle, their pace slow and measured as they moved closer. My thoughts raced as I struggled to rationalize what was happening. Maybe they were just following a similar route through the store. Maybe they didn't even realize we were overlapping so much. But the timing was too precise, too deliberate. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears as I tried to focus on my shopping, each step shadowed by their presence. I turned sharply, heading back toward an aisle I'd already been through. This time, I deliberately grabbed something random, a box of herbal tea I didn't even drink. I placed it in my basket and watched from the corner of my eye as the stranger appeared moments later. They walked to the same shelf, hesitated for a second, and then grabbed the exact same box of tea. My chest tightened as the reality sank in. This wasn't random. They were following me, mimicking my every move. I put the basket down and turned to leave the aisle, hoping to shake them. I darted toward the back of the store, weaving through a maze of aisles in no particular order. When I stopped and glanced back, they were there again, standing just a few feet away. The stranger wasn't even pretending to browse anymore. They simply stood there, their head tilted slightly as if observing me. I couldn't see their face clearly beneath the hood, but their posture was unnervingly calm. I clutched my basket tighter, a cold dread settling over me. I had to get out of the store. I abandoned my list entirely. The milk, the bread, the snacks, all of it could wait. My only focus now was getting out of the store as quickly as possible. The basket felt heavier in my hand as I made my way to the checkout lanes, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The stranger wasn't far behind, moving at the same steady, deliberate pace. I hurried toward the shortest line, a single register manned by a bored-looking cashier. As I placed my items on the belt, I risked another glance behind me. The stranger had stopped at the edge of the checkout area, standing near a display of magazines and snacks. They weren't browsing. They weren't even pretending to shop anymore. They just stood there, facing me. The cashier rang up my items with robotic efficiency, oblivious to the growing panic in my chest. My hands fumbled as I reached for my wallet, dropping my card onto the counter. I hastily swiped it, barely hearing the monotone, "Have a nice day," as I grabbed my bag and bolted for the exit. The automatic doors opened with their familiar whoosh, and I stepped into the cool night air, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The parking lot was mostly empty, the overhead lights casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. I turned back briefly, expecting to see the stranger following me out, but the doors remained closed. I walked quickly to my car, resisting the urge to break into a run. My keys were already in my hand, and I unlocked the door with shaking fingers. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors immediately and started the engine. The familiar hum of the car felt like a small comfort, though my eyes remained fixed on the entrance to the store. The stranger appeared moments later, stepping out into the parking lot. They stood under the harsh glow of the lights, their face still hidden beneath the hood. For a moment, I thought they might walk toward me, but instead, they turned and moved slowly to the left, disappearing into the rows of parked cars. My heart was racing, but a sliver of relief crept in as I realized they weren't following me. I backed out of my spot, my eyes scanning the lot for any sign of them. It was only when I reached the street that I allowed myself to exhale. But the unease lingered. Who were they? Why had they been mirroring my every move? No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that their behavior had been deliberate. The drive home felt longer than usual, the quiet of the empty streets amplifying my paranoia. I checked my rearview mirror constantly, my eyes darting to every pair of headlights that appeared in the distance. Was that car following me? Was it them? The questions churned in my mind, my grip on the wheel tightening with each passing mile. Even when the streets grew emptier and the headlights disappeared, the tension didn't fade. I replayed the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some sort of prank, I thought. Or maybe the stranger was simply lost in their own world, unaware of how their actions appeared. But deep down, I knew neither explanation felt right. There was an intent behind their behavior, a silent message I couldn't decipher. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, letting the engine idle. The darkness surrounding my house felt suffocating, the shadows along the fence suddenly more menacing. I scanned the street one last time before stepping out and hurrying to the front door. Inside, I locked the door behind me and checked every window, making sure the blinds were drawn and the locks secure. The quiet of my home, usually a source of comfort, felt oppressive tonight. Every creak in the floorboards, every groan of the house settling, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was over. The stranger was gone, just another shopper who happened to act strangely. But as I moved toward the living room, something caught my eye. A faint light flickered across the blinds, a car pulling slowly down the street. My stomach knotted as I peeked through the corner of the blinds. A vehicle crept past my house, its headlights off, its silhouette eerily familiar. It slowed near my driveway but didn't stop, continuing down the road until it disappeared around the corner. I closed the blinds quickly, my pulse racing. Even now, I can't say for sure if it was the same person, the same car. But the fear has stayed with me, a constant presence in the back of my mind. Every time I step into a store or see a stranger lingering too long, I find myself scanning their movements, waiting for that unsettling pattern to start again. The store always felt different at night. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed louder, the aisles longer, and the silence heavier. Closing shifts were a regular part of my job, and I'd grown used to the quiet routine of tidying shelves, balancing the register, and locking up. It wasn't glamorous, but it was predictable, a calm end to a usually busy day. That night had been no different, at least at first. The usual crowd had trickled out as closing time approached, leaving the store nearly empty. I'd already flipped the open sign to closed and begun the final checks. Only one customer remained, browsing the aisles without urgency. I had noticed them earlier, a nondescript figure in a dark hoodie and jeans. They hadn't seemed out of place, blending in with the evening rush like any other shopper. Now, as the minutes ticked past closing time, their lingering presence felt less benign. They weren't browsing anymore. They were loitering, moving slowly from one shelf to another, touching items but never selecting anything. At first, I told myself they were just indecisive, maybe unaware the store was closed. But the longer they stayed, the more I felt a faint unease creeping in. I cleared my throat as I approached them, putting on my best polite yet firm tone. "Just letting you know, we're closed now. Is there anything I can help you find?" The customer didn't look at me. They were standing in front of a display of canned goods, their hand resting on a tin as if frozen mid-decision. For a moment, I wondered if they'd heard me, but then they shifted slightly, turning their head just enough to acknowledge my presence. "No," they said quietly. The word was flat, devoid of emotion, and they didn't elaborate. Something about their posture felt wrong. The way they stood, slightly hunched, as if trying to make themselves smaller, or perhaps to obscure their face under the hood. I couldn't see their expression clearly, but I caught glimpses of pale skin and lips that moved faintly, as though they were murmuring to themselves. The store suddenly felt colder, the air heavier, as I stood there watching them. I stepped back and forced a smile. "All right, well, just a reminder we're closing now," I said, my voice a little less steady. They didn't respond, their hands still resting on the tin, their fingers lightly tapping against the metal. I returned to the register, pretending to busy myself with paperwork, but my eyes kept darting to the security monitors. The grainy black and white feed showed the customer lingering in the same aisle, unmoving. The minutes dragged on, each one amplifying my discomfort. The store was too quiet. Even the usual hum of the air conditioning seemed distant. Every few moments, I glanced toward the entrance, willing the customer to leave. But instead of heading to the checkout or the door, they began to move deeper into the store. Their steps were slow, deliberate, as though they were in no rush to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't looking for anything. They were just there. I tried to focus on the closing routine, counting the cash in the drawer and tidying the counter, but my hands were shaky. The back of my neck prickled with the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see them standing there, but the aisle behind me was empty. When I looked at the monitors again, they had moved. Now they were near the exit, standing motionless by the automatic doors. The doors didn't open. The sensors only triggered for movement toward the outside. It was as though they were waiting for something. My heart pounded as I watched them on the screen, their silhouette framed by the glass doors. They weren't looking at the shelves anymore. They were just standing there, unmoving, their heads slightly tilted as if listening for something. The uneasy feeling that had been simmering all evening boiled over into full-fledged fear. I stepped out from behind the counter, my voice shaking as I called out, "Excuse me, we're closed now. If you're ready to check out, I can help you. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." No response, not even a glance in my direction. I took a hesitant step forward, my shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud, echoing through the empty store. The customer didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, didn't even shift their weight. It was as though they hadn't heard me, or worse, were deliberately ignoring me. The thought crossed my mind that I should call someone, security, the police, anyone. But my phone was at the register, and I didn't want to turn my back on them. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't safe here. Suddenly, they turned their head toward me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see their face clearly beneath the hood, but their posture was tense, almost predatory. The door was behind them, so close, yet they didn't leave. Instead, they took one small, deliberate step forward. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. My legs moved before I even made a conscious decision. I turned and bolted toward the front counter, grabbing my phone and keys in one frantic motion. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I sprinted toward the store's exit. The automatic doors didn't open at first. My momentum carried me so quickly that the sensors didn't register me until I nearly collided with the glass. They slid open just in time, and I stumbled into the cool night air, my shoes scraping against the asphalt. I didn't dare look back. The fear was all-consuming, primal, driving me forward without pause. My keys fumbled in my hand as I unlocked my car, throwing myself into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. From the safety of my locked car, I finally looked toward the store. The brightly lit interior stood in stark contrast to the dark parking lot. Through the glass doors, I could still see them. The customer hadn't moved much, still lingering near the exit, their hood casting their face in shadow. But now their head was turned slightly, as though they were watching me. My hands trembled as I dialed my boss's number. Each ring seemed to stretch on forever. When he finally picked up, I stammered out what had happened, my words tumbling over each other. "There's someone in the store," I said, my voice shaking. "They won't leave. I think they're dangerous. Please, can you come?" He hesitated, his groggy voice betraying his irritation at being woken up. "I'm on my way," he said finally, and the line went dead. I waited in the car, every second feeling like an eternity. My eyes were glued to the store's entrance, half expecting the customer to emerge at any moment. But they didn't. The brightly lit interior revealed no movement, no sign of them leaving or even shifting positions. They seemed frozen in place, an ominous presence that refused to dissipate. The sound of an approaching engine startled me. My boss's car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He parked next to me and stepped out, looking more annoyed than concerned. I rolled down my window, my voice trembling as I tried to explain again. "They're still in there. I didn't know what else to do." He frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the store. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'll check it out." I wanted to argue, to stop him, but fear had rooted me to the spot. I watched as he walked to the entrance, keys jangling in his hand. The doors slid open with their usual soft hum, and he disappeared inside. Minutes ticked by. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rustling through the empty parking lot. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I stared at the entrance, waiting for any sign of movement. When he finally reappeared, my heart leaped into my throat. He stepped outside and waved for me to join him. My legs felt like lead as I got out of the car and approached him, my breath shallow and uneven. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of confusion and irritation. "There's no one in there," he said flatly. I stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. "What do you mean? I saw them. They were right there. They didn't leave." He shook his head, gesturing toward the interior of the store. "I've checked every aisle, every corner. There's no one. The doors were unlocked, but nothing's been touched. It's exactly how you left it." His words didn't make sense. I had seen them, standing there, watching me. They couldn't have just disappeared. My stomach churned as I followed him inside, the familiar space now feeling foreign and hostile. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the aisles in stark, unflattering detail. Everything was eerily still, as though time had stopped the moment I left. We walked the store together, my boss growing more agitated with each step. "Look," he said, gesturing to the security monitors. "No one's here. No damage, nothing stolen, just an empty store." I stared at the screens, half expecting to see the customer reappear on the grainy feed. But the monitors showed only static silence, the aisles barren and lifeless. It was as if the figure I'd seen had been erased, their presence nothing more than a bad memory.